listening to the Pro Bono Happy Hour. I'm Rena Glazer. Welcome back. Have you heard? The PBI Podcast Network is expanding with a new feed. Want to learn about the world of in-house pro bono? Stay tuned for our new program and listen to chief legal officers discuss the importance of pro bono and equal access to justice. Today's guests are Nancy Anderson and Arusha Gordon from the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights Under Law. We spoke with them about the National Nonpartisan Equal Protection Coalition and how pro bono lawyers can advance and defend the right to vote. We hope you enjoy our conversation. Nancy, Arusha, welcome to the Pro Bono Happy Hour. Thanks so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having us. Thanks.
So we're actually having a number of firsts today that you may not know about. First, you're the first guests to come here to our studio, which is actually a conference room at our worldwide headquarters in Washington, D.C. Other guests have called in on the phone, so that's exciting for us. And you are our first guests, plural, so it's the first time that we've done a duo other than we've done in-house podcasts. So we've done threesomes and it's been fine, so it's super exciting for us. And producer Dave, I'm sure, is up for the challenge. So with that, let's jump right in. Could you tell us about your backgrounds and your journeys to the Lawyers Committee?
So I'm Nancy Anderson, and I am the Director of Pro Bono and Legal Mobilization for the Lawyers Committee, and I have been there for over 17 years, shocking as that may be. But in terms of how I got to the Lawyers Committee all those years ago, I actually had a job at a law firm coming out of law school, and I turned it down much to the chagrin of my parents, because I decided I wanted to pursue public interest. And so I ended up with the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services for a bit doing welfare law, and then I was at the American Bar Association working on children's issues and homeless advocacy, actually working somewhat with Esther Lardent, the founder of PBI. And then after that I came to the Lawyers Committee.
And I'm Arusha Gordon. I have been at Lawyers Committee for about 3 years. And currently I'm Associate Counsel in the Legal Mobilization Project, which covers a few different issue areas that we work in. And when I was graduating from law school, I knew I wanted to do something that had a racial justice focus. And I also knew that I wanted kind of a multitude of tool sets to be used in the work that I was going to engage in. I wanted to do litigation, but I also wanted to work at a place that uses policy as an approach to advancing the social justice issues, and then also a place that has programmatic, organizing, kind of engages with the grassroots. And so Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights hit all of those things, and so I was thrilled to start out as a fellow and then move into an associate counsel role.
So since Nancy mentioned switching gears, as she was plotting her career, what attracted you to the public interest sector?
That's a good question. I think I just realized I wanted to make a difference. And in all honesty, I loved going to UVA Law School, but I didn't like law. And so most of what you learn in law school, at least at UVA at the time, was corporate type law, and I had no interest in. My then boyfriend, now husband, was a big public interest guru, and he had a huge impact on me deciding to change gears and pursue public interest.
Anything to add?
Why public interest?
Yeah.
I think I've always kind of been driven towards public interest, and that's probably just because of my parents are both teachers and have always encouraged public service. I think for a long time I thought I was going to do something more international, and so I actually spent some time in Cairo and Paris before deciding to come to law school in the States to focus on domestic civil rights issues. And I think there was just a realization I had that to really have a big impact, it's important to work in one's own community. And looking at the issues we currently have in the United States, I realized there's just plenty of work to do through our own state and federal governments.
I think people are always interested in hearing about what attracted people to purpose-driven work as their primary functions. So hard to believe, but there really are people who are not familiar with the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights Under Law. So could you tell us about the organization, who you are, and what you do generally?
So the Lawyers Committee was founded in 1963 at the request of President Kennedy and the Attorney General Robert Kennedy. And it came about after Governor Wallace stood on the steps of the University of Alabama and was defying the Supreme Court in Brown v. Board of Education, the subsequent case requiring desegregation. And so President Kennedy brought 250 of the country's lawyers to the White House and said, you will be the Lawyers Committee. And the goal was to get the private bar engaged and also to care that the rule of law was being defied in the South, at least during the Civil Rights Movement. And so since that time, the Lawyers Committee has worked on civil rights issues, voting rights, housing discrimination, environmental issues, education, employment discrimination, criminal justice, sort of, the broad range of civil rights issues. And we do impact litigation, but we also have impact pro bono projects and also a big public policy department. And my role as director of pro bono is to work with our staff attorneys as well as the law firms in the development and then placement of our cases, and then also working with our staff on our impact large-scale pro bono projects, of which one is election protection.
And I'll just say, as an active litigator at Lawyers Committee, that I just love working with our pro bono partners, and I don't know where we would be without them. We're filing 2 briefs today, and they're both really exciting briefs, at least I think they are. And, we worked hand in hand with our pro bono partners and are getting them out the door, and hopefully they'll have a real impact once they're filed.
Yeah, and I did fail to mention that one key point. One of the things that really differentiates the Lawyers Committee from other public interest legal organizations is that our mission is dual-fold. One is to promote and work towards equal justice, but the other half of that is to do so by marshaling the resources of the private bar. So on everything that we do, we work with volunteer lawyers.
Well, that is an awesome testimonial to the power of pro bono, and we did not plan that in advance. So I am shameless in my self-promotion, but we didn't. So
I am very appreciative of our pro bono, especially right now, because if we didn't have pro bono partners, there's no way I could be here today because I would be stuck rereading a brief rather than
underwater for sure.
Yeah.
So that's a win-win. Win-win. So let's pivot a little since we're going to laser focus on election protection. Do you also call that EP, or is that just a thing?
We call it EP, and I'm sure we are going to reference it.
Great.
EP
Great.
In just a few minutes.
Yeah, so if we lapse into EP, that's what we're talking about,
yes.
Election protection. So when and why was EP started, and what is it? What is election protection?
So election protection is the nation's largest nonpartisan, it's very critical, nonpartisan voter protection coalition. And the Lawyers Committee is the lead organization, but we work with many, many other state, local, and even national other public interest groups that are a part of this coalition. And it assists voters in nonpartisan civic engagement organizations with problems and guides them through the voting process. And it's available all year, but the centerpiece is our program on Election Day, certainly, and leading up to it. It was founded after the 2000 election fiasco, but it probably hit its stride in 2004 when we had our first national election protection program. And at its centerpiece is a national voter hotline that voters can call to ask questions about any number of things, or if they're experiencing problems trying to vote, they can try to get some assistance in getting answers and possibly even help. And then we also have a volunteer legal field program on Election Day where we have voters out in the field who are also gathering information and assisting voters.
Yeah, I think our election protection program is really effective and also a lot of fun to work on, especially, for instance, working on the hotline. What I appreciate about it is I spend a lot of time doing impact litigation and working on these more macro issues, big change. You might not see the result of your case you filed for 3 years. You might spend 2 years investigating one issue, blah, blah, blah. election protection, you get to help voters on that day and also know the result of it. Many times you put down the phone and you've helped that voter cast their ballot. And that's a really, really satisfying feeling when a lot of the work we do, there's not kind of that instant gratification.
So let's go back a little just to set the stage, because not everyone will remember hanging chads and, what went on in 2000. So what was the impetus? Like, what were the problems that the effort is trying to solve and attack?
That was a long time ago, wasn't it? 16 years ago. So trying to remember the specific instances of what happened, I have to tick back.
Or just
yeah. I mean, I think that the general takeaway was, for those of us who don't remember or who were too young to remember, is that at least our presidential election wasn't decided until December, and then by the Supreme Court. And part of that was because the votes that were counted in Florida and in other states were so close, and then within the state of Florida, just as an example, there were inconsistencies in how ballots were counted, in the hanging chads, which is an old-fashioned voting machine where some of the ballots weren't counted because the poll hunch didn't take out all the whatchamacallits, and this is where I am not an expert. But there were lots of problems, and I think a lot of people walked away being very, very frustrated. And so election protection was created to be able to help folks either get the answers they needed in advance, and also to respond on election day. It often could just take a phone call from maybe an expert to someone who's working a polling place saying, hey, this is a problem, can you deal with it? And also EP, an important part of EP is that we learn from past problems. And so that during the year, in between elections, our folks and our coalition partners are working with election administration officials to solve problems or prevent problems. And being able to learn about those problems and track them then helps future elections run more smoothly.
It seems like it's a really smart part of the effort, that not only are you helping people and solving problems in the moment and maybe a little longer term if things are, turned into a bigger issue than what can be solved with a phone call or something like that, but the learning that you gather then is actionable in terms of leading to future improvements. And if you don't have that boots on the ground, immediate learning, you don't know what needs to be fixed. You're not informed, right? And you can't be proactive because you're constantly reactive. So it really gives you a leg up.
And I think that's one of the things that also sets election protection apart from some of the more partisan efforts, that we're this established organization and coalition that's there every single day of the year, and we get to carry our data over. So a lot of the times, more political campaigns might get data, but then the campaign is over, and so that data kind of gets lost. Whereas, we'll track it, we'll go back and look, we'll see which precincts had problems. We'll use the data we get from our hotline to advocate for better voting policies or other changes.
So you mentioned that EP is a coalition effort, that there are a number of organizations involved, and who are they? We don't have to TikTok each one, but in general, who are they? And how do you all work together? Because sometimes, yes, it's better to work together, but that can create inefficiencies. And collaboration can be an ideal, but it can be hard to actually implement. So how does it work?
We have national partners, state-level partners, local partners, partners who are affiliated with tribal organizations. We have partners kind of at every stage. And we do work, EP is very collaborative, and so depending on who the partner is, that kind of determines how we work with them. So if it's a local grassroots organization, we might defer to them on where there's been problems in the past, which counties really have not been friendly to making sure that voters have access to the ballot box. If it's a national level partner, our conversation might be different. Maybe it's a report or bringing in more volunteers to our call centers located in DC or whatever it is.
And I think one of the benefits of election protection being 12 years old is that all the organizations that have been working on an EP over those times, that we've all fallen into sort of a rhythm and a pattern. And so it is well established that the National Lawyers Committee is the one that's sort of putting all the pieces into place, sort of the big infrastructure, the hotline, the online database where we track all these complaints, and that we're the ones who are tracking all the different local and state programs that may be going on. And, we're limited staff, so if there is a national civil rights organization that has a long-standing partnerships in a state or work, and they're like, hey, we want to do a program in Louisiana or Alabama or Mississippi, we're like, great, here's the phone number, please promote it, and then on election day they'll get access to those calls coming in from their state. So it really varies, and then even in some states it may be that the local partners like, we don't have the resources to do anything, but we'd love you to come in and organize a field program, and we'll put your phone number out. So it really varies, but I do think 12 years into it, that's in part why this thing runs so smoothly at this point.
Yeah, working out the kinks, right? Maturing, learning, building credibility. I think all these things are really important to this effort, but they're also common denominators in building long-term, sustainable, whether it's public interest, social justice, pro bono programs. There's certain common denominators or best practices, and they work for a reason. So let's dig in and talk specifics about how EP deploys pro bono lawyers. And you talked a little bit about helplines, field programs, other things. So let's kind of put some flesh on the bones and talk about what this means.
Yeah, and when we were talking about our partners, we were talking about public interest groups just a minute ago. But law firms are critical to the success of election protection. EP would not be successful, hands down, no question, if we didn't have our law firm and volunteer legal volunteers across the country. So for those folks out there listening, we need you, seriously. But volunteer lawyers are used primarily in two ways, and we use them in other ways, but it is to staff the National Voter Hotline, and then also to do these field programs. Now, there are 3 National Voter Hotlines. One that we run is the 866-our-vote, which is primarily English. And then we have the 888-VE-VOTA, which is run by the National Association of Latino Elected Officials, which is our Spanish language. And then we also have an Asian language at 888-API-VOTE, which is run by the Asian American Justice Center, the AAJC, and then also API-A-VOTE. And so for the 866-our-VOTE hotline, which on election day we will have, I think, 15, 17, something like that, call centers across the country, primarily housed at law firms. So trained legal volunteers, which can also be, in addition to lawyers, paralegals, legal assistants, and law students, sit through a 3 to 4 hour shift and take calls for voters. That hotline is active year-round, and it will be answered by live legal volunteers starting probably in early December at our office in Washington, D.C. So for those listening from Washington, we're going to need your help sooner rather than later.
You said December.
Oh, December. I meant to say September. September. It'll be live in September.
Soon, a couple weeks,
through
right?
election day, right? I think I'm in denial that it's already August 3rd, which is yikes. So we use legal volunteers for that, and then we also use legal volunteers for our field programs, which are across the country. And Arusha, you've done some of that work, right?
Yeah. So we do deploy legal volunteers out to different states as well. So for instance...
In states.
I'm sorry.
We don't send lawyers across...
Right.
Across state lines to do this work.
So if you are attorney, paralegal, legal assistant working in a state with an EP program, or if you're interested in creating one, we will, at times send volunteers out to monitor voting at the polls itself. And of course, you're trained on that. So that can be a lot of fun because you get to engage with the voters on a face-to-face basis. You can see a lot of things happening. You're also kind of this first line of defense if something goes wrong or if there's a violation of a voting rights, you're kind of armed with the information to speak up and say, hey, this is a problem, this is, impeding someone's right to vote, and what can we do about it?
I also like that you mentioned office space and in-kind resources, because I think sometimes that's an under-recognized leg of the stool to make these things work. That we need the time, we need the expertise, we need the people power, but we also need other things. And people can provide space and phones and phone lines and food and coffee, and these are in copying services and Wi-Fi, and all these things are really valuable. And when you're thinking about a huge effort, you have to think about all these aspects too. And how could you run a huge hotline effort in many cities if you have no place to put people and no mechanism to do the phone calls and phone forwarding, and it's a lot to put together.
No,
so,
absolutely. I was just counting up. I mean, I think at the moment we are looking at having 21 call centers live on Election Day, and I think 19 of those will be at law firms. Now, the numbers are somewhat in flux because we are still finalizing some of our local call centers, but 19 different call centers at law firms. That's a tremendous commitment and a help to us, because those call centers, if they're live only on Election Day, have to be set up and ready to go on Monday to be tested. For some of the national call centers, which are based in D.C., New York, and San Francisco, they have to be live the following Thursday or Friday to be tested. So law firms are not only contributing the space, and, the technology and the food, but also the people to help make that run. And so it's just from the call center side alone is tremendous.
How do you decide where to have call centers? It's got to be some combination of need and available pool of humanity to staff them. So what's the sort of calculus ratio? Is there a recipe?
Well, in 2004, when we were first creating the program, we looked at cities in part where there were large legal centers, lots of big law firms, because that's the market that the Lawyers Committee traditionally works with. And so that's how we initially had call centers set up in New York, D.C., San Francisco, Chicago, L.A., et cetera, et cetera. And interestingly enough, over time, many of those firms that signed up in 2004 are still doing it. And when they step up every 2 years, because we do have a large national program with every federal election cycle, we're delighted to have them back. It is interesting because, for example, in Houston, we have a call center now, and the first time was in 2014, because we now have a strong local field program and a local leadership team, which is another way volunteer lawyers can participate through our election protection leadership committees. They wanted to have a small call center there to be able to take the calls locally, which is fabulous. So, it's just that combination of exactly what you were saying, of where there's the need, and then where are there the folks and the places that can house it. But the beauty of technology is that we can decide where the calls go. So, the Houston call center, they just get Houston calls. And if they get too many, we know exactly where those calls are going to roll over to, and that call center will work closely with the Houston folks on any issues that may come up from Houston.
Yeah, I think that's one thing we're kind of exploring and continuing to grow is almost sister programs where perhaps an attorney in a different state, in New York or California, perhaps has ties to another state that historically has a lot of voting problems. Not to say that New York and California don't have their share of voting problems, but we will have, sometimes we'll use that as a model. So maybe you're an attorney working in a certain office, but you have a background in Virginia and you want to help us prepare our frequently asked questions or other election materials. We'll rely on volunteer attorneys to help prepare those materials. And of course, you don't have to be in the state to do that.
Yeah, I mean, it's good to be nimble, right, to reallocate your resources and address needs and be flexible. So what types of support do you provide pro bono lawyers who want to get involved? I'm sure most of them are not election law experts, and there has to be processes in place that people get trained, or there's help on the day of. So what kinds of support do people have?
We've really taken our training very seriously I would say the past 2 years, we've really tried to give a lot of thought to how we train people. And so we've developed a comprehensive training that's kind of streamlined, so you get the information you need either as a hotline volunteer or a field volunteer. And there's also a system where some volunteers who might be a little bit more engaged will become election protection captains. And so those captains might have a little bit more of a training and a knowledge base. But yeah, everyone kind of gets training as to their needs in how they're volunteering.
Yeah, no. So all volunteers have to go through a 1.5 hour training. Is it still 1.5, or is it moved to 2?
It's 1.5.
1.5 hours. A lot of those will be on demand online this year. Some will be in person, either at a physical place or with a live webinar. But everyone must complete that, and then they sign up for their training and a shift at the same time. But then they participate in their shift. And so, in addition to the training, though, there are written materials on every state. So that's the frequently asked questions. It's a 6 to 7 page document that answers probably 80 to 90% of the voters' questions. And if the question that comes in, or to the call center, or if there's a field volunteer who is, at a polling place and there's a bigger problem than what photo ID do I need to bring into the polling place? It goes up the food supply line, or the command chain, so to speak. So if you're at a call center, there are these captains who are literally roving around, and the volunteer just has to raise their hand, and the captain is right there to assist the volunteer. If it's more difficult, then the captain will take over, and in some cases, if it's extremely complex or worrisome, that might require a call to the Secretary of State's office to say you've got a big problem, it'll go up to our National Command Center where you've got the big voting experts. And it's similar in the field. So if there's a problem, they call into their local legal command center, and then there you've got your captains and your other experts who will help deal with that issue. And of course, our field programs are working closely with our national call centers on election day. So there's a big line of support up and down for volunteers. And one of the things that I think the good things about the training is not only is it trying to give you a sense of the types of questions that you'll be asked, but we've also tried to help them see what they're going to do. Like, you're going to walk in, you're going to sit down at the desk. The phone's ringing, there's a computer, what am I supposed to do? I mean, we help walk them through that so that it's not just a complete shock and I don't understand. So
yeah, I think from my experience, I think people end up feeling extremely comfortable that it may sound in the abstract challenging and remote and foreign from your expertise, but the questions for the most part are quite answerable, and you have materials, and we're able to look things up, and we're able to answer things, and then there are human resources if things get out of slightly beyond that. As Nancy said, it's definitely triaged in a way so that you could kind of, as things get more complicated or rare, you go up the food chain. That way your training doesn't need to be overwhelming because you're not educating for things that have a remote possibility of occurring. And I think it is a testament to how big a difference you can make.
Yeah.
Sometimes things are quite basic, but they make all the difference. They aren't basics to the person calling. They need information.
And I'm glad you said that, because one thing that we do try to make our volunteers aware of is not every call that comes in is going to be the polls aren't working, or there's a police officer who's intimidating us, or all the big, maybe really potentially interesting and sexy things. A lot of them are going to be basic questions. Am I registered? Where do I vote? Those are very basic. But sometimes voters can't find that.
I think the question, where's my polling place, is something like 70% of the calls we get, which is so satisfying to just be answer the call, give them their information, they're off to vote, and just to do 10 of those in a row, and you feel like you've made a difference, if not, on the national scheme, to that one person. And we do talk to voters. I was talking to a voter a couple days ago, and he's elderly. He lost his right to vote because he had run into some trouble with the law when he was a kid. And now he's in his 70s and his health isn't great, and he really wanted to be able to vote. And to be able to talk to a voter and talk about what he could do to get his right to vote back and help him vote. Sure, he might not make, that one vote might not actually tip the balance, although it could, given our elections are so close these days, but it means a lot to individuals.
Right, so that's one of the interesting examples that folks could help a voter with. But even going back to the sort of basic ones about where do I vote, am I registered, what photo ID, that's actually a complex one, believe it or not, and no surprise given it's probably going to be even more complex given the most recent decisions that have come down, because will all the polling place workers be appropriately educated? Provisional ballots, that's so if you don't have maybe the photo ID you're supposed to have, can you vote? How is that vote counted? And one of the things that I wanted to say about the value of election protection was a personal example of a friend of mine who was a partner at a law firm. This was a couple years ago, a local election in Alexandria. She had 2 small kids. She had to wait in line an hour and a half. You know, they're with her, they're starving. She gets up, and they say, do you have your photo ID? She's like, no. And this was before Virginia had long implemented our current rules. And they said, sorry, you can't vote. And so she left. But because she had like a 3-year-old and a 5-year-old who were starving, and she just waited an hour and a half, she didn't vote. Well, if she had called us, we would have said, you can vote provisionally. You need to say, I can vote provisionally. Give me my ballot, and then you sign an affidavit and whatnot. And if this is a partner at a law firm who doesn't have the confidence or doesn't think to ask, you can only imagine what so many people in the U.S., what their response is if they're told to leave or with incorrect information or they have no idea. So I appreciate that EP, even with the most basic questions, provides very valuable help to voters. And then, of course, within that, you'll get the big problems that impact a lot of voters that we can try and solve as well.
Or even along the lines of very simple questions, a lot of voters we get calls from don't have access to the internet.
Right.
And so for us, sitting at our hotline center, it's very easy. It takes under a minute to look up a polling place given someone's address. But for that voter, it might be a trip to the public library, or maybe they have to wait for a kid to come by to help them navigate the internet or whatever it is. So it's really just providing the resources that are very easy for our trained volunteers, but are tougher for other people to access.
Arusha, that's an amazing point, because I think listening to some of this, you might think, well, this is just a let me Google that for you, sort of project. But these people cannot get that information themselves. And if you aren't sure what time your polls close, call and find out. It can make all the difference to these people and their right to vote. So I think it's an important point to emphasize.
It is. And the second follow-up point I'm going to make, because then law firms are going to say, well, why is this pro bono? If you're saying all we're doing is looking up voter registration, that's not pro bono. Anybody could do that. We do get a lot of those calls, but the issue is we get a lot of those other calls, and we can't screen those out. And so we do need trained legal volunteers to take those calls who can answer and help with those other problems and real issues that come up. And the photo ID issue, we're sort of laughing about this, but there are going to be possibly lots and lots of issues, and in particular because of the recent decisions, polling place workers aren't going to always have it straight. And so voters need to be able to call someone who knows the law and can say, under the law, you can do A. So it's really critical that we have the trained legal volunteers.
I'm nodding my head because what we find frequently is that poll workers haven't been trained properly, or they have the wrong information, or for whatever reason, they're kind of spreading misinformation. And so to be able to have a voter who might talk to a poll worker and be like, that just doesn't seem right. Like, I thought photo ID, I didn't think photo ID was required, to be able to call us. And so we can clarify it for that voter, but we can also, as Nancy was mentioning, get in touch with our local partners on the ground, who can then get in touch with the local election officials and then kind of stop the systemic problem just because that one voter calls.
Yeah, that's another great point, right? How boots on the ground or the information that you receive, it can percolate, this could be a problem. We need to do education in that precinct before this really gets out of hand.
They can do it day up, right?
Yeah.
Our local person then talks to the appropriate local official, and they call the polling place and say, hey,
and
we got to stop saying these things.
I'll add, just in terms, again, of how we work with our local partners, that we do try really hard, especially in our targeted states, to set up meetings with local election officials. So for instance, I work in Virginia right now, and we're working with our local partners to go through and meet with the voter registrars at each county that we're going to be most active in, so that we build that relationship with them. So then on election day, if one of our lead volunteers calls, they already know that lead volunteer. It's Bob, who they met with in September, not Bob, who they're talking to for the first time on November 8th. So there is a longer-term strategy there as well in building those partnerships.
And I think it is incredibly important to people who may not feel comfortable, right? Something's fishy, that doesn't really seem to be what they read in the paper, or it sounds wrong. The difference it makes when they can say, now, I talked to a lawyer, right? They're really right. You're really wrong. It can be a difficult situation, and often there's an imbalance in power or privilege or education, so being able to have backing is important.
And also that despite the fact that many of us have the internet in our hand, many of the folks who call don't, but many do, I mean, how you distill the information is very difficult. There's too much, right? Yeah. So to be able to call and get a quick answer, a quick, simple answer is also a critical resource.
Yeah, and I think, as you know, our election laws are so complicated, and they are varied and variable across the country, and they are ever-changing, so no doubt there will be confusion, and even with the best of intentions, confusion. Not every confusion is malicious, it's just confusion. That's a problem, too. So, as Nancy knows, within your own work at the Lawyers Committee, but also in the world, it's a crowded marketplace of pro bono opportunities. So what's your best pitch for why people should get involved and do EP?
Well, Arusha gave a great answer earlier, but and we'll go back to that shortly. But I mean, for those with limited time to do an hour-and-a-half training and do a 3-hour shift, awesome. A second reason is, and we've been talking about this, election protection's been around for 12 years. We are, very established, and generally we know what we're doing. We've got strong infrastructure in place, good systems, and so that's always, a nice thing when you're volunteering your time. And the third is, to me, hopefully the most important, which is what Arusha was talking about and some of her examples. It's just, voting is our most basic right as American citizens, and to be able to help others who are eligible and should be able to cast their vote and have that vote counted is tremendous, whether you live in a blue, red, or purple state, or yellow. I mean, it just doesn't matter. Every citizen should be able to vote and have their vote counted.
And I'll add that I think my pitch to my friends who are associates and partners at law firms is just that it's a lot of fun. And it's a way to really be engaged. So, for instance, everyone's talking about the presidential campaign right now. And it's a way to be engaged and actually make a difference without making a huge commitment of time if you don't want to. If you do want to make a larger commitment of time, we will also work with those volunteers. But that, when I talk to my friends who I've recruited to come be volunteers for us on Election Day, they end their shifts and they're just abuzz with the energy. And they just want to talk about all the people they talked to and all these crazy stories they got and the people they met. And the fellow volunteers you meet are also totally fascinating. And, I don't want to, pitch it as a networking event, but, it definitely is a plus. You meet really interesting people. You meet lawyers who are at firms, who are in government, who are at pro bono organizations. So it's just a lot of fun, in addition to all the things Nancy said.
And I have one more I just thought of. It's not just about the presidential election. Voters who are voting in that are also voting in their state and local elections. And if you're helping them to vote for the presidential, that means you're also helping them to vote their local school board members or their other, county officials. And those officials have the biggest impact on your day-to-day life. And so, remember that as a volunteer is also
and
great.
I would add that a lot of races are just really close. So, maybe we get a ton of calls from a certain county, and those calls actually do end up having an impact. For instance, we got some calls in 2014 from a couple counties in Virginia that were having problems with voting machines because a lot of voting machines were bought over 10 years ago, and I can never keep a laptop for longer than 3 years, so the idea of keeping a computer running for 10 years is pretty crazy. And so these machines were feeling their age and breaking down. And we got some calls, and because of those calls, we were able to submit testimony to the Virginia Board of Elections and help get those machines decertified, so that now in 2016, hopefully, knock on wood, those voters in those jurisdictions will be able to cast their ballots without machines flipping who they voted for, which was the case in 2014. It can have a real impact. Or another example that comes to mind is in 2014, I was sitting in our hotline room with a volunteer, and I think I was filling in as the captain at that point, and the volunteer took a call, and he kind of put them on hold, and he's like, this voter who just called was telling me that the poll worker, this is an early vote situation, that the poll worker had told them that they were leaving early that day, that they had to go pick up their kid from soccer at 3:30, and so he was going to close the polling place at 3:30. Well, you don't get to just decide that, you have to go pick up your kid. And so the volunteer and I discussed it, and both, we were like, no, that poll worker has the wrong information. So we chatted about it, and the volunteer actually decided he would take the step and call the county registrar and inform them. And the county registrar was very appreciative that we had flagged that one of his people he had hired had the wrong information. And so they were able to go and tell the poll worker to keep the polling place open. And so the early vote place was kept open for, until it was properly time for it to close. But that was just an example of, this volunteer answers the call, we chat about it, and then we get to keep this polling place open. And so we don't know how many more people voted at that place, but probably a handful.
Yeah, bottom line, making a difference. And social and convenient and important and on and on and on. It's incredibly compelling and ripped from the headlines and don't whine, get involved. The proof is in the pudding, right? Because you have so many repeat volunteers. They wouldn't come back if they didn't have a good experience. And part of being an Evolve program demonstrates that. So let's talk about the elephant in the room. And Nancy danced around this. And it's not a confrontational question. You hear it all the time. And I'm sure some listeners are wondering, how is this not partisan, right? How do you guard against either the reality or the perception that just because it has to do with elections, surely it must be. So how do you explain or allay concerns or fears of reality or perception?
I mean, we are completely nonpartisan. We have volunteers from every political party in the room, and part of our training is emphasizing that it's nonpartisan.
And, we only work with nonpartisan coalitions. And maybe just as an example, we're in like all the states. We do work. We have a big program in Texas. We have a huge program in Chicago. Those tend to go traditionally one way or the other. So, we just don't care who we're helping. We just strongly believe in the right to vote. And again, the training and our partners and where we're working show our non-partisan status.
And I think that's where your track record comes in handy, too, because I'm sure this was a really big issue at creation, right?
This was concern, absolutely.
Right? And as time goes by, you have a track record to rely on to say, this is about the process. This is about our rights. This isn't about determining an outcome. This isn't about, sides. It's about voters. It's about the process. It's about our rights. So access to the ballot. And
absolutely. Absolutely.
So you both shared some colorful stories already. Do you have any other sort of meaningful or moving stories that you wanted to share?
Sure. So I think there's a ton that come to mind, which is part of the privilege of being able to work at a place like Lawyers Committee. But, in addition to helping get junky old voting machines decertified and new machines put in place, and helping keep polling places open, we've also been able to help people get their voting rights restored after they've served time, which is a really satisfying thing to be able to do, to give people that second chance. And also larger issues. So, for instance, I guess this actually is not technically EP, but for instance, getting early vote locations set up on Native American reservations. In my current role, I work a lot with Native American folks on voting rights issues, and we'll see that people in rural areas have to drive incredibly long distances to cast their ballot. So right now I have one client who actually has a 9-hour round trip to vote in person. And that's just crazy. And so being able to use some of the information we get from EP to identify those issues and then get a solution so that people don't have to drive 9 hours to vote is an incredible experience.
We've also had, just as an example, and I referenced this earlier, instances where outside of polling places you had police officers parked, and in this one instance, it wasn't necessarily that the police officer was trying to be intimidating, but in the community that he was at, it was actually making people feel uncomfortable and not wanting to go vote. And so we were able to approach the police officer, one of our field folks, and he was very like, oh, sorry, that wasn't my intentions, I will leave the polling place. So even there where there's not malicious intentions, we were able to have a positive impact. And those kind of stories just go on and on and on and on and on.
Yeah. I think one of my favorite aspects is when you take that call, if you're a hotline volunteer, even if that call is just for 2 minutes, in those 2 minutes, I feel like I become a team with that voter, and it's kind of like, okay, Mrs. Smith, who can't find her polling place or doesn't know what kind of ID, like, we're in this together and we're going to figure this out, and then, it's just really satisfying, and the voters are most often very appreciative.
We talk a lot about pro bono being about human connections, and I think that's what's happening, right? Even in a short call, you're making a connection and you're helping someone be more human, exercise their rights. It's amazing. So do you have in your life for your professions pro bono or access to justice role models?
I saw that question.
I think it's, like, for me, it's a difficult one. So when I came out of law school, turned down the law firm job, I would joke with friends who went to law firms that they'd gone to the dark side. And now I fully appreciate how those law firms and volunteer lawyers from firms play a critical role in helping us secure equal justice. And so while I don't have maybe one person in particular, I just really embrace the role of law firms and in-house counsel and their pro bono programs, and law schools and their pro bono programs. Just that, to me, is my role model, the fact that the legal profession has this pro bono ethic and that we follow through.
Yeah, and that the profession isn't black or white, right? It's not private bar, public interest. There's a big gray area that we can all work together. There's so many problems. We don't have the luxury to be so siloed that way. So, yeah, I think that's a great way of thinking about it.
Yeah, I would agree. I think one of the cases I was recently working on, our pro bono co-counsel was a woman who I actually went to law school with, and we were just coincidentally put on the same case. But she grew up actually in a part of Montana where there's a high Native American population. I think she might have even grown up on a reservation. And so she brought this incredible insight to the work we were doing that played this huge role. And I just appreciated, all our pro bono co-counsel, but especially in this case, the fact that she brought this insight and that this was on top of, other stuff she was already doing. So, yeah.
And that you could have a reunion, so that's
Exactly.
Personally lovely.
When you're up at 1 a.m. preparing for depositions, it's a lot more fun to be doing it with a former classmate.
With people that you like, yeah. So we have covered so much territory. It's been amazing. Are there any final takeaways or things that we didn't get to or things you want to emphasize that you want to just be sure we leave listeners knowing and understanding?
Yeah, so if you're interested in volunteering, please go to the election protection website. You can Google that, or it's 866ourvote.org. Again, 866our vote.org. And you can sign up, and then you'll be notified once the specific shifts and trainings are up, and you'll get the email, and then you'll be able to sign up directly. So we hope you'll do that. But in tandem with that, if you are at a firm or you're in-house at a legal department, make sure your pro bono counsel, the person who is heading up your pro bono program, is aware of your interests, so that they also will notify other folks in your office when my emails start coming around. And perhaps the last thing is just a little plug for the early morning shift. We have the hardest time getting volunteers to show up at these call centers at 6 a.m., but that's when the polls open in many places, and that's when the most calls we get. So I had to do a little plug towards that.
Yeah, it's perfect. It's like your justice workout, right? You got to go to the gym early or you don't get to it. So do your pro bono work early and then move on. Yeah.
I'll say it's a very interesting time to be on the phones as well, because there's a lot of issues in the morning when poll workers are getting there or not getting there, as the case can be.
Right, right. Why is my place shut? Why are the doors locked?
Right.
What's going on?
Right.
Yeah.
And I'll also make a pitch for our social media platforms, so you can visit us on Facebook or on Twitter, and we do have folks monitoring those, so if you send us a message through one of those means, we should get it. No promises, but we do try to keep those updated.
That's amazing. Well, Arusha and Nancy, thank you so much for joining us. It was a pleasure speaking with you today.
Thank you so much for having us.
Thanks.
Thanks for listening to our discussion with Nancy and Arusha. We thank them for their time and for sharing their expertise with us. To learn more about election protection, visit the Coalition's dedicated website, 866ourvote.org. That's 866OURVOTE.org. Additional episodes of the Pro Bono Happy Hour can be found on iTunes and YouTube. Be sure to subscribe if you haven't already, and take a moment to leave a review. We'd appreciate the feedback, and it would help make it easier for other listeners to find the program and expand the conversation about pro bono and access to justice. To learn more about the Pro Bono Institute, visit our website at probonoinst.org. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time on the Pro Bono Happy Hour.